Coming up on today's show.
I'm an engineer. I work during the day in a creative but not visually creative manner. And so the visual creativity that I get to do while designing and making quilts really kind of fits a hole for me that I don't get otherwise. So what I came up with is this method of, making cross blocks that were perfect, right? That were square, but I made them much larger than what I wanted them to be, so that when I trimmed them to their actual size, I didn't have to trim them square. I tend to learn by messing things up first, and then
Okay.
as an engineer, trying to ask, well, how did I do this wrong? What can I do to improve and iterate? So that's been the way that I've kind of learned.
Hi there. I'm April Page, breaking down the what, when, where, and how creatives get their inspiration. I'm a big fan of the cursey words, and I've been a creative for 30 plus years in marketing and fine art. This is where creatives unite to break down the facts of creative life. Buckle up. Let's get lost in the world of creativity together. Welcome, everyone, to Artist Antics with April, where we talk to creatives about creativity. And today I'm very excited to sit down to talk to modern quilter and engineer Charles Cameron. And Charles is North Carolinian with his bold, color driven designs. He blends precision with playful experimentation. His award winning quilts have been featured in major shows like QuiltCon, where he earned first place in his piece called Sudoku. And through his work teaching, lecturing patterns, and Charles inspires artists to embrace curiosity and rethink traditional techniques. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. Yeah, and yeah, as you mentioned, we're practically neighbors. So
Yeah,
I've been looking forward to chatting with you for some time. Thanks for having me.
yeah, I'm happy to make you a part of the group. It's my plan to create this community of creatives where
I
we
love
can
it.
all share with each other. I just haven't figured out what platform that's going to be on yet,
Oh,
but
I get it.
yeah, so I'm going to be doing that this year in the near
Okay.
future so we can throw out questions to each other and see what comes
Yeah,
back. Yeah. So
sounds great.
so I asked this of all my guests. My first question is, what does your spark of creativity come from? Like, I don't
Yeah.
know if you want to go to the beginning of quilting or maybe before that. I don't know if you had, creative life before that, but I'm just curious. And I know where mine came from like my family and growing up around a lot of creatives. And
Yeah.
I just love asking that question.
Yeah, so I think I've always dabbled in hobbies. I think I've done every hobby there is. And sometimes they catch and sometimes they don't. And I can remember even back into like elementary school, loving to get the fresh crayons at the beginning of the year and like doing all the coloring pages. So I've always been kind of like interested in that. It captures my attention and allows me to express myself. I think, fast forward more recently, as you mentioned in the beginning, I'm an engineer. I work during the day in a creative but not visually creative manner. And so the visual creativity that I get to do while designing and making quilts really fits a hole for me that I don't get otherwise. And I think what has kept me going with this hobby that perhaps hasn't in the other is the community that's around. You mentioned QuiltCon, which is the show for the Modern Quilt Guild. They're a wonderful resource and wonderful community. Similarly, we've got a chapter here locally in the Raleigh-Durham area. So just all kinds of wonderful ways to interact and encourage one another and learn from one another. So those are my primary inspirations.
No, that's great. I'm very curious to find out how has your engineering and your quilting kind of influenced each other. And I think I understand because both are very structural, but they're
Mm,
also creative at the same time. So
sure.
that makes sense to me. But I'm just curious if they influence each other at all in your mind.
I think very much. When I first started quilting, when I first started, I wasn't attempting to make a quilt. My starting story is that, back in 2018, I was seeing all of these really lovely improv quilts on Instagram coming up in my feed. And of course, they were beautiful and all of that. But my brain wanted to know, how is that done? How do you engineer all these curved shapes and sew them back together so that they lay flat? And so that's really how I started. I bought just a couple fat quarters of fabric, not knowing at the time what a fat quarter even was, how much fabric that was, or how long it would last. You just started cutting it up and sewing it back together and then iterating to try to get it better and better and better and more precise too. So I think that's the other part of the engineering that I pull in. I do like projects that are very precise in nature. I can work very small, very teeny tiny pieces. But as you mentioned, in the end, I kind of also have this desire to just flash it up and move it around at the very end, which is where the creative whimsy part takes over. So for me, it's the intersection of those two, the art and the science, that I think has really propelled my interest in the quilting.
I guess that's what you're talking about is your first quilt that happened
Yeah.
by accident.
Yeah.
So what was that quilt? I don't know that I know when it was.
It's called Crooked Crosses and Bent Boxes. It was the first quilt that I made. And so, like you said, the origin story there is I was seeing all of these really wonderful quilts. My primary influence was Jill Fisher, who was an improv quilter at the time. She's Pie Lady Quilts on Instagram. You should follow her if you don't.
Sure.
And in the 2018 time period, she was making all of these really beautiful wonky crosses. And I wanted to figure out how to do it. I could conceive how you make a perfect cross and you cut it straight and quarter-inch seams
Right.
and all of that. But like, making it wonky, I couldn't wrap my brain around it. And I was too chicken to reach out to her to actually ask for instruction. And so I just started, like I said, buying fabric and cutting it up. And it wasn't working very well for me because my engineering brain, again, continued to want to do things very precisely. So what I came up with is this method of making cross blocks that were perfect, right? That were square. I made them much larger than what I wanted them to be, so that when I trimmed them to their actual size, I didn't have to trim them square. I could rotate my ruler
Mm,
and make these wonky crosses that then just when I put them together, they appeared to dance across the quilt top, which is exactly what inspired me by Jill's quilt. And that's kind of evolved. That's been my approach for many different quilts subsequently, is you do the precision up front, and then when you get to the end, you twilt it or slash it or turn
yeah.
it, and it becomes just a lot of fun to piece things back together.
No, so cool. Thanks for going through that. So, my grandmother and my great aunt were seamstresses.
Sure.
They taught me how to sew. I used
Uh-huh.
to have to pick a pattern and pick a material back when there were pattern stores.
Of course.
And for the summer, I would have to sew my my shirt or shorts or dress, whatever I was working on. So, because I know a little bit about sewing, I'm not going to say I haven't done it in eons, but I'm just curious, how do you know what stitch to use? I'm sure
Yeah.
that's just with learning, but how do you know what stitch to use for these precise seams and how do
Yeah.
you get it precise? Because I know even just using the foot and the pull and the
Yeah.
fabric, depending on the fabric, you can get wonky even though you think you're straight.
I know, 100%. So
So how does that work?
for me personally, I tend to learn by messing things up first, and then
Okay.
as an engineer trying to ask, well, how did I do this wrong? What can I do to improve and iterate? So that's been the way that I've learned. How did I find the right stitch length? Well, I messed it up several times and they unraveled and yada. And
Yeah.
there's another technique that I use to get really straight, precise lines. It's called foundation paper piecing, where you sew the fabric to a piece of paper that's under it.
Mm,
And by having that paper, you can actually draw straight lines and you can be really precise. But of course, that comes with a lot of practice and
right.
repetition and iteration and so I continue to learn new tricks and tools. The community again is really wonderful because somebody's
Right.
always doing something better, more interesting, more precise than
Right.
you are. So it's always great to just to see what they're doing and ask for help.
It reminds me of the patterns because when we did the clothing patterns, we have those edges and seams in the pattern, and
Yes,
you would pin the pattern to the piece, and then you would chalk where those lines are,
for
or
sure.
use one of those rolling chalk things. I forget what they're called.
Yeah,
Anyway, so take us through your process from, first of all, what inspires you and why, and then take us through from inspiration to a
sure.
completed quilt and the steps in there.
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about some of the quilts that I've been making recently as part of a bee. Just like our grannies, a bee is a group of people that gets together and they make blocks and they sew the blocks together, etc. So I'm part of a bee that I joined 4 years ago, I think now at this point. We're not local, so we're all over the US. We talk by text message and direct message. And our process is there are 11 of us in the group. And so each month, a different person takes turns writing the prompt. So it gives everybody something to think about, usually an inspirational quote or some element of design or something like that, and a color palette, and then request blocks that are X by Y. And so that has been a really fun process for me as of late. One, in I really like coming up with a creative prompt that I think other people will be excited about. I always try to work a couple steps ahead, trying to anticipate what I might get back and what I might do with it. But of course, I'm always surprised in that regard. But I think what's even more lovely about that experience is the 10 times out of the year that I get to work on somebody else's prompt, right? Because I've developed a way to think and design quilt on my own. It's my own idea and I know how to iterate. But when you get a prompt from somebody else, you have to start way over here. Might be a color
Yeah.
palette that you're not used to, or a technique that I'm not accustomed with, or an inspirational message that you haven't thought about. So it takes you a while to devise what is this going to look like? How do I translate that
Right.
into graphic design? So that has been a really exciting part
That's
for
like
me.
adult play. It gives you mental flexibility, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure.
We talk about
And then
that a
maybe
lot.
just I'll mention one more thing. A couple of the prompts that I've written previously are ones where I've asked my fellow B-mates for a fairly large block to come back with the intent of, and I tell them beforehand that, hey, I'm going to sew them all together and then I'm going to cut them up and I'm going to sew it back together and I'm going to cut it up and I'm going to
Oh,
sew it back together, cut it up. So I've done that with 3 quilts now, each one kind of iterating on the previous idea. But that has also been a lot of fun for me, not being constrained to the square blocks that I get back, but having the idea to reorient them and then again, chop them up, move them around. It's like a puzzle over and over and over again.
no, that's great. It's almost like the constraints are only your imagination, really. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great. That's awesome. So, back to your inspiration to process. What are
Yes.
those steps in between?
So I tend personally to spend quite a bit of time in the design phase. And when I'm working on a quilt of my own, one that's not part of a B, I usually tend towards graphic design as inspiration. So architectural posters or graphic fonts or things of that nature, just something that are colorful geometric shapes, sometimes very abstract, sometimes very literal. And then always, I'm never trying to recreate that artist's work in fabric. I'm always trying to iterate or ask a question. How could I change this? Or how could I merge 2 of these ideas together? So for example, you mentioned the Sudoku quilt in the
Yeah.
beginning. It was a mini quilt that I made in response to a prompt. There was a prompt from the Curated Quilts magazine, which no longer is in publication, but was a really great resource for modern quilters a couple of years ago. Quarterly, they'd put out a prompt, and the prompt that I responded to was, hey, we want you to use the element of stripes as your design, and we want you to be inspired by the word balance. And then, of course, they suggested the color palette. Well, so those are really nice wide constraints, right? So for me, for balance, again, I'm an engineer, so I think about balancing equations, balancing my checkbook, balancing math, da 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 da. So I wanted to do something with math, with numbers. And then similarly, around that time, I had seen this really beautiful font on Pinterest that were all of these, it was made from a bunch of lines, very graphic, almost didn't even look like numbers. But I
Yeah,
thought, hey, I
it
can combine
doesn't.
those. They didn't, right?
Your quilt doesn't look like numbers to me. In fact, I was going to
Yeah.
tell you, it looks like a video game to me.
So
Yeah,
I
but go
get that a
ahead.
lot,
Here.
and it's really interesting because I think it's kind of half and half too. Some people don't see it at all until you walk them through and
Mhm,
explain it, and then other
mhm.
people see it right away. And I think maybe it's the more engineer math inclined
Yeah.
folks. Not that one is better or worse, but that's the way our brains work. So he was marrying those 2 ideas. It was stripes, numbers, balance, and pulling from all of these pieces of inspiration that I had seen previously and pinned on a board and came up with this design, which again just kind of utilized these fonts, but then I had to execute it, right? So to execute it, they were very tiny stripes. Mine were a quarter of an inch when they finished. And so again, I had to draft a foundation paper pattern. So I had to go onto the computer, I had to make this pattern, print it out, and then I'd sew all the fabric onto the back of the paper, and then kept doing that over and over, and finally ended up with a quilt. The quilt is tiny, so it's about 14 inches square. It was a mini. That was the prompt. But yeah, that's kind of how I work through things.
No, that's awesome. That it's so much more creative than I ever anticipated. I was just walking around in awe with my jaw open at that show. It was just fascinating. Anyway,
QuiltCon
So,
is an amazing show for
oh
sure,
my
for sure.
gosh, it was like an ocean. I was like, what? But so you focus heavily on bold colors, which is near and dear to my heart because
Of
all my
course.
pieces are very bold. Value placement. And I want to talk about, what do you think most artists in general, quilter or not, and about the use of color? I have my own opinion that I will
Yeah,
throw in, but I don't want to color yours.
no, no. So great question. So first, I'm gonna start with value because I personally think value is more important than the actual color
It's
itself.
way more important.
So I tend to, so Jill Fisher, for example, my original inspiration, one of her suggestions was make sure you have 7 different color values in every quilt that you make.
Right.
You
Right.
take the picture on your phone, on your iPhone, turn it black and white, and then just make sure you've got this range. And I could see in her quilts and then in others how they were so much more alive, so much more vibrant when you were using lights and darks to your advantage. It's another way to tell the story that sometimes people don't imagine. I often notice this in painters. I will see a painting that is beautifully executed, technically wonderful, even brilliant colors, but they've constrained themselves. And oftentimes, I think to the lighter, valued colors.
Yep.
And so it reads a little flat to me personally. It doesn't attract my eye as much as one that has super light highlights and super dark backgrounds. And maybe those are only 5 or
Yeah.
10% of the frame, but I think it just really provides so much more depth, whether it's a
Yeah.
quilt or a photograph or
For sure. What a good tip for everybody listening to us, regardless of what medium you're using. And I learned from one of my art professors to do underpaintings to the value. So I would use a sienna or a burnt sienna and or an umber, depends on what it was. But I would start the underpainting, meaning you did the sketch. Now you're going to paint that sketch into the darks and lights that you're talking about.
exactly.
So I don't have to worry about, because I've done the sketch, I don't have to worry about composition and perspective. I've already done that part with the sketch. And then doing the underpainting in one color, even though it probably hardly, maybe a speck of it will be showing, it helps with the value to figure out the value before you even put color on it. And when you come back to your point with all of those colors,
Yeah,
exactly what value you want to use in that spot based on everything else. So it really breaks down because painting's complicated. People don't
sure.
realize how many steps and how much thinking goes into it before you even start. And I just love doing it that way because it helps me not have to think about all of those things at once.
Got
Yeah.
it. No, 100%.
So how do you do that with quilting? Your values, you do it in the black and white first, and then that helps you determine, and then you assign a value to those different ranges or
So
learn the
often
different ranges.
couple tricks. So I do teach a class, which is the crooked cross and bent boxes class. And what when I'm setting up a workshop, I always give some pre-instructions for folks. And the first and foremost is be adventurous. Your quilt will be as warm no matter what colors you use, right? So let's
Yeah.
not worry about it too much.
Yeah.
But I do prescribe them to use, hey, pick 2 lights, pick 2 darks, and pick 4 that are somewhere in the middle.
Middle.
And then this particular quilt, it relies a lot on mix and match. So you cut up all the pieces, you cut the same number of pieces from every color, and then you mix and match them. And when we're mixing and matching, I'm always suggesting to people, hey, you will intuitively want to put a light colored background and a dark colored cross, or vice versa. You want to have all of these high contrast blocks. But what I recommend is no, we're also going to make some that are low contrast, right? A couple blocks that are really light in value. The background, the cross, the little center, almost so if you squint your eyes, you can't see the actual shape. And so by having all of those variations of value combinations is another trick that I like to use to help move one's eye around a quilt. And with that, you're doing all of the work up front, right? So you are picking your
That's right.
values, your colors, your fabrics at the very beginning. And then because it's mix and match, everything's kind of random. It just, the math works out, which is really lovely. If you try not to pay too much attention, which oftentimes that's easy to do. And so that's one of the things that I recommend is start at the beginning, knowing what your range of colors is. And then again, I apply this mix and match technique so that they just fall into a random spot.
Oh, that's great. And So that's kind of playful too, and very creative. And what I struggle with in my own work is telling people or showing people when I teach every once in a while myself, but I'm trying to teach them you have to have the technique and the basics, what we're talking about,
Sure.
stitching and learning the thread length or the stitch
Yep.
length and all of that. And then once you have those down and you've practiced and you know what you're doing there, then you can open it up for the magic to happen, is what I call it.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
you can't really let go in your thinking until you have the technique and the basics down, in my humble opinion, with art anyway, with painting.
I like that as an idea. I'm going to pivot slightly. Again, my strategy is always mess it up first so that you can figure it out. And I'm kind of a jump in and just try it sort of a
Yeah,
thing.
me too.
So I would almost advise, don't constrain yourself as an artist to get the stitch length right first, right? Do it. Just try it on something little, right? Don't do it on a
Right.
whole quilt your first time.
That's right.
And then use that as a way to iterate. Ask, what do I like about this? What don't I like about this? What went wrong? What was easy? What was hard? And you just continue to iterate.
The good thing about quilting is you can always undo it. So
That's right. I've got
that
seam rippers in every. But people are scared, I think, to do that. I was scared in the beginning. I thought, oh, once you place the seam, you've created a hole in the fabric and it's there. And the same is true for cutting, right? It's very difficult sometimes to cut into that piece of fabric in the beginning, especially
yeah.
if it's a higher valued piece of fabric. But it's those little things that we can get hung up on and we just got to get over.
So speaking of cutting and seam rippers and all the things, what specific tools or brands like equipment, sewing machines, scissors, software are you using, material brands that you love, thread brands, etc.?
These are all really wonderful questions. Before I will get to that, but I will say one of my favorite tools to use in quilting is actually painter's tape. And again, of which I've got pieces stuck everywhere on my sewing machine,
Oh,
rolls
do
and rolls.
tell.
Well, it's when you're doing really tiny piecing, a pin would normally be used to keep pieces of fabric together so that you can sew them precisely. But when you're doing really tiny pieces, just inserting a pin warps the fabric so much that sometimes you can't get a very straight line, or at least it's more difficult. So when I'm working on this technique of foundation paper piecing, again, where you're sewing on the back and following a straight line, rather than pin the piece of fabric to the piece of paper, I use painter's tape. And everything remains flat and you can reuse it over and over again like a
That's
pin. And it's just
great.
wonderful. It's one of my favorite things. Aside from that, so what are some of the brands that I personally like to use? I have a Bernina sewing machine.
Mm.
I really love it. It's Swiss made. It works very well, has a ton of wonderful features. I have a Bernina store here in the Raleigh-Durham area, about 20 minutes from my house. So that was kind of the primary reasons. And I don't have a lot of experience with other brands. So I'm not necessarily saying it's better or
Yeah, no, but
anything,
that's
but
a
it's
good
what I
point.
use.
Anything
Yep.
that's in your local area that can help service you if you have any
100%.
problems is important. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So that's what I happen to use. For my fabric, I'm big in solids. A lot of modern quilters will use solids. Certainly, it's not a rule, but just I think 3 times out of 4, that's what you'll probably see people use. I like the Kona brand of cotton solids by Robert Kaufman. For me, they have a really nice hand. They feel very cottony and they feel
Mhm.
thick, a little thicker than some of the other fabric brands. They also have a huge variety of colors, 365 to be exact, which I think I haven't found another line or brand that has more than that. So for me, that's just like having more paint, right? It's having
Yeah.
all 96
You don't have to mix
crayons.
the colors.
Exactly. So Kona solids are what I like to use. I'm an Aurifil thread enthusiast. They just have really lovely cotton thread. It never gets hung up in my machine. I've had the experience with other ones. And again, have such a variety of colors. Probably not 365, but at least 200, I would imagine.
Yeah,
And I think those are most of my must-haves.
makes sense.
Of course, we always have to have a pair of scissors that we don't use on paper, right? We always have to
Right.
have a pair of fabric scissors, and my kids know never to use the fabric scissors.
I have a
Yeah,
really nice pair that I inherited after my grandmother passed. I have her sewing kit and her fabric scissors, and those things are so
they're
sharp.
so wonderful.
They're serious, and you get them professionally sharpened or whatever.
I do have one more tool now that I thought about it just a second. You asked a moment ago about software. I mentioned I spend a lot of time in the design part. I like to iterate the design multiple times sometimes before I start cutting or commit to a color. And people are often surprised to find out I just use PowerPoint.
Okay.
PowerPoint has 98%
Hey,
of the functions that all of the expensive design software packages
right.
have.
Whatever
Uh,
works.
so you
If
can
you
make
have it.
squares and triangles, the drunkard's
Yeah.
paths, and you can color them and you can import fabric swatches electronically. So PowerPoint works really well for me.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I use software. It's very cheap. I think it might even be free now. It's called Procreate.
Oh,
And I use that with my iPad. So when I want to do reference images and put them together, a tree from this image and a bird from this other one, and put them together, and I just make the outline so that I can make it my own.
yes.
That's what I use on my iPad with the Apple Pen, and it works really great for anybody listening to us that wants to
Yeah.
create another option too.
Well, I'll add to that. Procreate is really popular with the quilting community.
Is it?
And
Oh,
again, sure that
interesting.
there's probably other programs, but often at QuiltCon, for example, there will be a class or two on how to use Procreate
Great.
specifically in your quilting practice. So great
Awesome.
for quilters.
I'm sure you can go on YouTube and look that up too and get some
For sure.
tips. But
Absolutely.
Hey, real quick, every other week I sit down with real working creatives, no filters, no fluff, just the truth about what it actually takes to build a life through creativity. If that's the kind of content you want more of, please subscribe. It's free. So you never miss a conversation that might just change how you see your own creative path. And I also share painting videos and videos talking about meaning behind each one of my art pieces. So drop a comment below. Tell me what's resonating. Tell me what you want to hear next. This channel's growth is because you show up for us, and I very much appreciate it. And now let's get back to the good stuff. So, what would you give artists as advice to get their work into major shows or publications like QuiltCon? How would you tell them to start? I'm sure you give some of this in your classes, but I just
Sure.
would love to hear that.
So I think sometimes just studying up on what has been in those shows previously,
Mm,
probably art shows, painting shows, every show has a unique perspective. They've got
yeah,
something that makes a quilt more fit for this particular show than another. So I think it's important to understand by looking at past winners or getting the catalog from a couple years ago just to see the themes and the color palette and the techniques and things of that nature. So that'd be one thing. You got to study a little bit to know that your quilt is going to fit in. I think the second thing that I would just encourage is try on a couple different levels. One, don't get too hung up in the, oh, my design's not perfect or, oh, my quilting lines aren't straight. Those will come with iteration, right? We never start off perfect, but still enter that quilt, enter it. I may be really surprised that it gets in or may win an award. So I think always give it a try. And I know that that's oftentimes there are costs associated with entering. For me personally, it's worth it. And I would encourage others. That's a good $20 to spend. I
for
also
sure.
think sometimes people tend to think, oh, I want to get into the big show, right? I got to get into QuiltCon or I got to get into Houston or all these. But there's a lot of really wonderful regional shows.
For
There's
sure.
also the enter your quilts into the fair. And again, it's just kind of that practice of doing it over and over again and seeing how other people do it and interacting with that community. It'll just get easier and easier and better.
Yeah. And it's the same with fine art. You do the same thing. You start smaller with the smaller markets, and then you
Sure.
go into the regional shows and art fairs, and then you go into try to get into the big jury. Once they see you've done some of those things and
Mhm.
how it all works, I think half of it is just them seeing that you've experienced some of those things already and you know
That's
how to
right.
set up and do those things. That's part of it. They also have to like your work, but that's the majority of it in my mind is they just want to
Yeah.
see that you're doing and you're going to represent them well.
I think having a positive frame of mind around it, I think, is also important. Sometimes the sentiment, if your quilt doesn't get in, might be, oh, I was rejected, or oh, the judges didn't know what they were doing, or the jury, or this. I tend to think of it not as a rejection, but just that it wasn't selected. There were so many other quilts that were selected, mine wasn't, and
Yeah.
that's okay. And like you said, in the end, you're kind of representing the show. So if you're gonna complain or badmouth,
That's right.
that's not going to do well in the long haul. Not for you, not for anyone. So
No, for
positive
sure.
frame of mind. Congratulate everybody that got in. Study their work. What is it that they did, and iterate.
Great. So I want to go into teaching just for a second.
Okay,
So
sure.
you offer lectures and you have trunk shows and workshops. So
Yeah.
what do you love most about teaching other quilters? What is the best part for you?
Yeah, great question. So I think with the workshops, so I've made patterns out of two quilts that I've made in the past, and my intent is not to be a pattern maker.
Mhm.
That doesn't interest me. I like the process, but I'm not here to create a pattern. But I will say with the two that I've done, I did create the pattern because I thought it added a little bit of a unique perspective. It was a different flavor of chili that wasn't already out there. It had its own unique thing that I thought people might be interested in. So these two patterns, the crooked crosses, and there's a second one called tilted tiles, they all iterate on that original idea of let's make the blocks precisely in the beginning, just like our grannies would, just like everybody's
Mhm.
familiar with, quarter-inch seam and a straight edge and all of that. And then in the end, we're going to get fancy and we're going to make the wonky cuts, but we're going to do it with a ruler. You still use a ruler at every step. So what I really like to see in these workshops, the reason that I wrote these patterns is because I do think it's a very approachable way to start towards improv, right?
Mm.
Seeing people just give themselves permission to not square up the ruler. It's frightening for some people. In
Mm.
every workshop, the first person that does it, we hold up their block and we clap and we like it's a big deal for some people. So that's one thing that I really like to see, especially with some of the more traditional guilds. They'll invite
Yeah.
me in knowing that it's an approachable workshop, ruler at every step. And then to see some of the more traditional quilters walk out with this idea of, oh, I can do improv. I can do it's another tool in the toolkit. With
Yeah.
lectures, my lectures primarily, I talk about color and color value. So I'm oftentimes sharing quilts that I've made previously and then really going through not so much the graphical design of the quilt, but how I selected the colors, or more importantly, the color values to help tell the story, to help the quilt be quilt that it has become. And again, I think people will learn through that about what even is value and how can I use value as a tool in my toolkit. And so it's just exchanging those ideas with people through a lecture format, I find very rewarding.
Yeah, no, that's great. So do you have I have a few of my own, but do you have any breakthrough moments with your students that have really stuck with you, one you want to share? Yeah.
I think going back to what I said previously about the first time somebody cuts their
Yeah.
block crooked, that's always an exciting thing for a lot of people. It's a breakthrough moment for them to see. To improv seems very exotic to many people. It was to me in the beginning. But there's a lot under the bell curve of improv, right? You don't have to go all the way in the beginning to the slash and cut, and there's a lot of little intermediate steps that you can do. And so I think by going through these workshops and having them see, oh, I'm doing improv, it's just not this far side of the bell curve, I think is a great thing for them to learn. And I think a lot of people do walk away with more confidence to take the next step. Maybe they don't go all the way to the other side, but how can they incorporate some of these tricks and tools into their next quilt or project?
Yeah, no, that's great. So when you're doing these workshops, and I
Yep.
know I have a problem with this myself, so I'm selfishly asking, how do you design both for beginners and advanced quilters at the same time? How do you make it valuable for both? And I know usually I'm shooting for the middle
Hmm,
is a
hmm,
way
hmm.
that I do it, but I also am trying to give some tips to the beginners and then also
Sure.
give some tips to the advanced all at the same time. But just curious how you handle that.
So I think I have two suggestions maybe that I like to employ consciously. One is at the beginning of any lecture or workshop, I set for, here are my goals, here's what we're going to do, here's how I see this class unfolding, because I want to set expectations for them in the first place. So, I might mention, hey, I'm going to teach you a lot of the techniques, but we might not actually get the full finished quilt by the time this workshop is over. Or, hey, I want you to walk away with this idea of mix and match, right? That's something I want you to walk away with. So I think setting expectations at the beginning is a good way to do it. And also allowing them to voice their goals. Why are you here? What are you looking for? What will make you happy walking out the door? So if you can contract that in the beginning, I think that that's a great way to bring people together. The second thing that I like to do when I do a workshop is really watch the pace. So I will tend to spend a little bit of time at the beginning with this whole overview. Here's where we're going, right? Here's the 7 steps that we're going to go through. But then I'll only give instruction for the first step. And that lets everybody focus. And then they're able to work at their own pace for a little while. And then, hey, at the right time, hey, everybody, let's come back together. Stop where you are. Here's the instruction for the second step, right? And you will have, maybe you didn't get through the first step, that's fine. But let's keep going on these. And I think by pacing, it helps the slow people catch up, right? Gives them permission to stop what they're doing and move on. And you can also try to keep up with the pace with some of the faster sewers. You always try to look who's sitting with nothing to do or who's not, or who's moved on to the next step by themselves without instruction. So I think that's a good way to keep everybody interested, engaged.
No, very good tips. So before we close, where can people find you?
That's a great question. So I'm mostly on Instagram. That's my primary way of communicating and sharing. So I've got my Instagram account is Felt Like Sweets, all one word, obviously, no periods or anything. FELTLIKESWEETS. I also am really active in DMing. So send me a note, send me a question. I'll be glad to respond. And then around the Raleigh-Durham area, there's a couple things that I participate in frequently. There is a great group of people that meet on Monday nights at the Beer Study in Durham. So it's a open art night. We get together, we have a couple beers. I sit there with my hand sewing. There's knitters and all these other people. It's just a way to keep myself paced on some of these projects. Hold myself accountable, but then also learn and interact with others. I participate heavily with our local Modern Quilt Guild, the Triangle Modern Quilt Guild, which is a great organization, lovely people. Carrie Quilting, our local quilt shop, always has a lot of nice programs that you can participate in. We also, on occasion, will rent out their classroom just for a day of sewing. And then I'm a part of a group monthly that meets there, and that's where I work on donation quilts. So I set that time aside specifically to do the donation quilts, which I probably wouldn't get to or I'd put off if I didn't have some, again, a way to make me accountable. So those are the ways to find me in person, is hang out at one of those locations or come to one of those events.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for those listening, we'll provide Charles' information in the description. But thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you, April. I hope to see you at Arts and Drafts sometime soon.
For sure.
If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Feel free to nominate yourself or someone you know as our next guest. Thank you for being a part of our creative community. Stay inspired and keep shining bright.